This episode is part of our Better Ways of Knowing mini-series, which we're running on this feed throughout the summer. The Better Ways of Knowing project asks how we should produce, evaluate, and act on knowledge if the goal is to continue to improve the health of populations. And in this series, we're sitting down with people who were part of our first convening to hear their reflections on that question. My guest today is Professor Rebecca Messbarger. Rebecca is a cultural historian of early modern medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. She was part of our convening session on the integration of different forms of evidence to improve the health of populations. In this conversation, we discuss a case from the 18th century Bologna that illustrates how authority over the body has shifted across history, why she thinks public health focuses on the centers and averages while humanities tend to focus on the margins, what it would mean to take historical understanding seriously as a tool for translation rather than as background, and the long history of public health trust and mistrust in medical authority. We also talk about what it might look like to put performance and the arts more directly in conversation with public health research. Here is our conversation. Becca, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So in the convening, you were part of a session, the main discussion you had were part of a session on integrating different forms of evidence into our public health knowledge and medical knowledge. And you opened with a historical case about what is accepted as evidence in a specific moment. Can you walk us through that example and why that example stuck with you and you thought it was important to bring to the conversation?
Absolutely. And it's a question of evidence over time. So I began with a radical moment in Italian cultural history when the old order has to cede authority to a new order, the Enlightenment age. And I begin with a really harrowing story of a 23-year-old illiterate maidservant who is executed in the main piazza of Bologna for infanticide. And what ends up happening is conventional to the time. It's late December, early January, and it's the time of Carnival, and that is when the world goes upside down in terms of social mores and practices. It's the Carnival means goodbye meat, and she serves for a different kind of goodbye meat because her corpse is dissected publicly in the anatomy theater the day after her execution. And it's a cause célèbre because it's 3 years have gone by and they haven't had a woman to dissect. So people are really interested in seeing the internal female body, which was rarely seen in that context. They didn't have nearly as many women to dissect as men. And they also want to see the site of her crime. They want to see her reproductive body. And so people flock to the theater, including the cardinal, the head of the university, and then masked carnivalers go to see. And the point of the dissection is her reproductive organs, her uterus, which is keeping with the time. Only 30 years later, the scene changes radically, with the new dissector being a woman. So in this time of reform and a sort of beginning inklings of the democratization of knowledge and public health through public education, first of all, they introduced the notion of donor bodies, but it is a young woman who is dissecting cadavers in her home and creating anatomical wax models of the reproductive body that becomes a source of authority. So this is a radical change. And I talk about the fact that both women were lost to history for more than 200 years because their stories did not fit what constitutes authority in history. And it was only recently that both stories were uncovered, and you see this moment of radical expansion of who gets to know and sort of knowledge authority, and radical expansion of education about the interior body. So that's kind of what I was talking about, exclusion of both the particular stories we're talking about, and exclusion of this really important history.
And why do you think that's important? So you're a historian of early modern medicine, if I'm correct. Why do you think it's important to learn about the past, to learn about those really important stories? What kind of knowing is that? And why is that helpful then for our ways of knowing?
Well, my work is framed by the term storia in Italian. It has two meanings. Storia with a capital S means the transformative events that happen to collectivities. right? It's history. But storia with a small s are the individuals' lives, the accounts of individual lives who live within those systems, who live under the reign of institutions, within larger cultures, within larger populations, right? And I do think that public health is within the frame of history, but it needs to bring in story, as in individual response and experience, mainly, of living within that larger series of events. And I will say that I was struck in many ways by the anguish that I heard in our convening among researchers who are critically aware of the gap between system and individual story. And how do you bring in individual experience into these methods and collections of data? And so I do think that that dichotomy or integration, because they're both, is really critical.
I want to get to that part of the proof,
Okay.
actually, because I'm interested. I think I'm asking people who are not epidemiologists in particular, because they just have a completely different experience. For me, sitting in that convening, I really want your reflections on that. But before we get to that, because I really want to stop first on the use of history in how we frame public health right now. So first, maybe I want to know, because you clearly, your work focuses a lot on the anatomical work, and especially of the women whose work is usually erased and or forgotten. First of all, what pulled you to that type of work? Like, I'm trying to understand, like, it's very helpful. It's very helpful to know the history, but why? And also, like, what does that generally reveal about how knowledge is usually remembered or erased?
Right. Yeah. So I come out of a literary background, and that's what I got my degree in. And then I moved into cultural history somewhat late, but with the foundation of cultural studies and literature. And I was drawn to this because I saw so many intersections happening in that knowledge space. So yes, I turned my focus to the history of medicine and public health, but read through visual art, literature, read through institution building, through, it encompasses religion, criminal justice, all of these things that tell us about a culture. And the other thing that my sort of method is microhistorical. I look at artifacts, discrete artifacts, like anatomical wax models, and see what are these discrete artifacts saying about culture in a particular moment in time. And when you're looking at the reproductive body, women's authority, all of these things come into play. This gets represented in the literature, it gets represented in art, it gets represented in performance. And to understand a moment in time, I'm looking at all of those things. And I guess, why is that important? Well, part of what I'm talking about, these women scientists who emerge with tremendous authority in Italy in this period, unlike anywhere else in Europe. We don't usually associate Italy as, a center of great women's authority, but in this moment of the 18th century, it does become so. And one of the reasons it becomes so is because institutions see the value of women's authority as representing modernity, particularly the church. So all of that is just background. How is this important in the space of public health? Well, the 18th century, is this age of radical reform and democratization. Much of it was ideal and rather than real, right? But at the center,
ideal rather than real.
It's ideal rather than real. And at the center of that is the betterment of the human condition. So there was all kinds of attention to how do we understand the natural order of the body in terms of the ordered political sphere, the ordered social sphere, and even in terms of the place of religion, faith in this context. So health became a focal point. And women working in the realm of science in Italy were actually promoted by the church as a way of signaling their modernism and of signaling women have always represented a means to broader knowledge, right? I mean, in the 18th century, you have, women philosophers, you have Newton for ladies, you have botany for ladies, you have, women sort of were, you have philosophy, the dummies, the yellow books that you find in the bookstore, women were a means to broader public messaging. And so, this attention to anatomy, human anatomy, was about looking at the order of the interior body in terms of sort of universal natural order. So the microcosm, macrocosm kind of idea. And women were critical for that also because you've got sort of the universe of the uterus, the matrix, which was called the matrix, and the universe of the body, and then the wider universe, right? They were all seen to be reflections of each other. But there were also just really practical reforms in terms of public health, and a lot of that has been lost. It's just being recovered or being reanalyzed. I mean, even this emphasis on the compatibility of faith and science in the 18th century. We usually think of the Enlightenment as a very secular, anti-clerical age, and it really wasn't. So part of what I do is I'm just on the ground looking at all of these different things going on and trying to build out to understand the cultural time and space.
And I think, so to me, that's really interesting because I think it is helpful to just situate us on like how knowledge was produced over time, especially, and that's central to the question of the campaignings themselves. How do we get to a place right now on who gets to decide what knowledge counts today? It is very helpful to look into history. But I think what we usually, or at least what I usually struggle with, but I think history is helpful with that, is do we treat history as context in a field that focuses on future-oriented work interventions? Do we treat it as part of core of how we got here today? So it's not just context of what happened in the past, but also it's relevant to how we decide moving forward. Or like what would be helpful for us as public health to think about like the history of modern medicine, as you said, like the history of what happened during the Enlightenment. How should that shape what we do, and how do we do rigorous public health research work today? And where should we place historical understanding in framing the type of knowledge we need in public health today?
Yeah, and I think that it depends on what questions you're asking, I think, right? So if you're asking about culture, I think history is really important. If you're asking about the science, I think history can sometimes get in the way. What we often see, at least in my limited experience with public health crises, is fighting the last battle with those same methodologies, right? So you bring to COVID, you had a lot of people who were trained in HIV intervention and who were bringing that kind of, or whatever expectations of the past art and trying to apply them to the present. But when we talk about culture, I think it's critically important to consider history, and I think it's often done. I think it's usually done. When we had COVID, especially here in St. Louis, there was an immediate reference to the 1918-1919 influenza because St. Louis responded better than any city in the United States, and its economic recovery was quicker than any place else. And part of it was because of its shutdown. You had a mayor and a public health commissioner who worked in tandem to address things, and they did very unpopular things. And so there was a citation of that response, and then also a remembrance of the public response, which was pretty unhappy. The business community was angry, the church was angry, the people were angry, parents were angry. And I think those cultural markers in history can inform how we approach the present in terms of public health. And, history is one tool. Art and literature are other tools for translation. I really do think it's about the translation project, right? What is happening culturally? And it's, of course, never a one-to-one. You're not going to just expect a perfect replica of what happened in the past, but they can inform how we treat the current crisis. So, I mean, why did we reach for Boccaccio and Manzoni and Defoe during COVID? Because we needed translation tools for the human experience of these crises.
And it's interesting because I always wondered, and I think you mentioned this earlier, I was really hoping if I can just for a few minutes be in the mind of one of the people who are humanists or people who are coming from more like historians or the philosophers who are in the room, because I wanted to see, like, you're sitting in a room with a group of epidemiologists, physicians, and statisticians arguing about whether randomized clinical trials are the best way to create evidence versus not. And I always wonder, sitting in a room like that, what are you thinking? Are you thinking, oh, no, like you need to contextualize what you're doing first in history and then move forward with other items? Did you find something generative? Did you think, oh, no, this is where you miss, like us people who are public health or medicine, this is where you miss the framing of what needs to be happened? What was helpful for you in our discussion during the 2 days? And what was something that you thought, people in public health need to just go back to history and they will do a better job in what they're doing?
I was just really struck by the humility in the room. I thought that many of the concerns that I have about the relationship of policy, right? The implementation of policy over large populations, it was more dramatic among my colleagues in that room. There was, yes, I mean, when I say anguish, I heard anguish from some of the speakers about the mismatch between the study, the prescription of behaviors and modes of addressing public health issues, and the failure to meet the need, particularly of whether it's discrete communities or individuals, that it's not working. I just heard over and over. And so I think that, humanities, and I'm going to say humanities rather than history, is upstream from methodology. Humanities is looking at human experience, right? And that includes history. So it's looking at what matters to human beings and how people live and experience the systems in which they are often caught. And it often focuses not on the center, but on the margins. And I think public health focuses on centers, sort of averages, right? And it focuses on exceptions and story, whether it is history or literature or art. And I think, I also heard a desire for somehow mathematizing, for somehow creating models to account for that heterogeneity of experience. So there's this need to go back, but recognition that the methodology isn't satisfying the necessary repair of some of these problems, right? It isn't leading to necessary repair. And the other part of this is just the insufficiency of the messaging to a broader public, which has, it's the great paradox that Roy Porter, this wonderful historian of medicine, talked about, that the more efficacious our medical interventions are, the less trust the public seems to have in them. Yeah. And the sort of turning away from conventional medicine to alternative medicine, and we see it constantly.
Yeah. I actually like what you said about the margin versus center, but I also want to ask about trust. I know it's not particularly your field, but I'm actually very much interested in trust these days. So those two questions on what you just said now. So the first one is what you said about history and humanities centering the margin, or focusing on the margin versus public health focusing on the center. I think that's very interesting. I wonder if you think, and maybe this is just me going back to methods again, if you think qualitative methods get closer to the margin, or still in a way, I'm a quantitative person, so maybe I'm misinterpreting what qualitative methods do. But still, in a way, I guess qualitative methods try to put things into buckets. So it still tries to create stories like at the center, at the averages, instead of the margin. If I understood what you said correctly about what you mean by humanities and the margin. So I'm wondering, like, how do we reconcile the two? Like, how do we use history usefully in public health, or humanities usefully in public health, as we think about the methods we use and the interventions we use? And I know I'm trying to create something more practical from a more abstract conversation, but like, do we teach to our students for them to take history always as a context, or a way of thinking about, like, what do I think about a problem? Or if I'm working with a researcher in like a different context, like, how do we use the humanities to improve our public health interventions?
So I think it's a many-layered, many-approach answer, right? So I think that, for example, I teach a course called Mamma Mia. It's maternity, motherhood, and the reproductive body. And one of the things we do, we read a fantastic book by John Christopoulos on abortion in early modern Italy. And one of the things that's really important, I think, is to have a long view on some of these extremely vexed public health questions that have tremendous division. And what he shows is that in the early church, abortion really was not much an issue. It was defined, but there were all kinds of exceptions made within the church itself because lived human experience is messy. Family is messy. Women become pregnant in complicated ways, often outside of their control. All of that is in the history. And I think having information on that as policy is being developed, as public health, particularly public health policy, is being implemented, having a long view is really important and provides more complicated options, some resistance to the way things are categorized, because we tend to simplify what happens in the past. And it was much more complicated and much more ambiguous. And again, I use the word messy and maybe having that messiness somewhat present as we move forward. Another thing is I go back to this term translation, translating community experience, sort of local time and space, translating individual experience of health, illness, and care, right? Within these broader systems. How do we do that? I'm right now doing a podcast with 8 undergraduate students. It's a series called Across the Fence Line.
Yeah.
And we're interviewing, and these are all students who have taken courses with me, and they have this sense of history, they have this sense of culture, but we're interviewing the Across the Fence Line is looking at farmer and rural community health here in Missouri, and then more broadly. And we interviewed recently a doctor who works in rural Boise, Idaho, but he's worked all over Kansas City. He's an advocate for rural community health, and he has something called boot camp translation. So it's looking at public health research implementation, but giving authority to local community members that are selected, educators, farmers, to respond to the research that says these are the problems and these are the solutions. And so there is a kind of collaboration, but it's a translation on both sides of the equation, a translation for the researchers, but also a translation for these community members. And I know that that's not exactly what you are asking about, but I think that shows a kind of integrated approach that is, I think, pretty innovative and could be applied to all kinds of institutions, right?
Yeah.
Institutional responses to health, illness, and care.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So it does. It really does.
Yeah.
And I was thinking it's a really good approach, I guess, for students. Like, I think we can have more generative, helpful conversation as we think about how do we infuse this in our education. I think it gets even messier. Maybe that's the point as you think about like people intervening on the ground who are like public health department right now. If we want to give them some advice, what would that be?
Yeah.
It gets even messier because I think it might be harder to just say, oh, you should hire a historian of the specific area that you're working on.
Right.
They should be part of the public health department. I don't know, but I think maybe first step is just, as you said, infusing all of this reality of the world, context, messiness, whatever word you want to use within that education, and then moving forward and saying like, how could that actually be applied in the real world. So I want to ask you about trust. I know I didn't mention this, but you mentioned trust. So I'm gonna take the chance to ask because I'm increasingly interested in trust and what it means for public health. So just stepping back, are there instances in history when we see this happening a lot where clearly we're doing better? Like our science is better. It's clear. Hopefully, at least I believe we live in a world where a much better world than 200 years ago. I think to me, that's like unquestionably, at least generally speaking. But we are still like we're losing trust more rapidly than ever. It seems like every Uber I got on, if I say I work in public health or medicine, which is fair, I hear someone complains about why medicine is all about pharmaceutical companies just ripping off regular people. Again, not completely wrong, but it's just like a sense of like, I trust this influencer who told me something about buying a supplement from them. And somehow that is more trustworthy than a corporation telling me you should buy this product from me, even though it's backed by the university or by science. And I was wondering if there are like incidents in history where we see why this happens, why would we lose trust, or B, like, are there any other interpretations of why this might be happening specifically right now that you can think of?
Well, I think there's so many instances of backlash to particularly heavy intervention by sort of state or whatever the major authority is. And, we can go back 700 years and see how people responded to mitigation during the 1348 plague. And Boccaccio lays it out, right? There were 4 main responses: that people hid in their houses, or they went out to the bar, or they, or they abandoned their own family. But there was general lack of trust in institutions. And you see it over and over again. In the 1918 influenza, President Wilson never mentioned influenza. He never mentioned the pandemic in his entire presidency. And of course, there were all kinds of mistakes made in the public messaging during COVID and in every public health crisis. And the other side of it is, in all of these crises, there are hucksters, there are bad actors. And if you have terrible leadership, it has a profound influence on how people receive instruction, public health, instruction, if you are having contradictory messaging. So, and then just because we've been out in rural Missouri, talking to people, the lack of trust in even people who are on the other side of the fence line, who come from an urban environment or come from a university. We talk to a lot of public health officials working with rural communities, and they're sort of the intermediary between university researchers at Mizzou and WashU, and then the rural communities that they're serving. And they do a whole kind of boot camp re-education of the researchers and how to, your questions may not be the right ones. You have to have communication with the communities. But, I think I don't think that anything I just said is at all illuminating. I think it's probably pretty standard knowledge. But I would say, you said, should we have historians? And I would add, should we have artists, whether literary or visual artists, involved in shaping public health, in institutional roles? And I would say, absolutely, you should. And they are there. They are there. Holly Tucker is an early modern historian of medicine, has written great books, and she has an appointment in the med school. And they're there, whether they're speaking to ethics or they're speaking to this question of translation and story. I think they're there. Maybe those are
maybe not in
rare.
a public health department. Yeah. They're in academic settings, but that makes a lot of sense. No, I think it's interesting, and I don't want to harp on that point too much. But you said, oh, maybe this is common knowledge, or maybe this is not standard. And people say that, but then we still don't take context into account when something big happens. I think it's the question that, when you say it makes sense, and I think we could recognize also almost all the good things that happen in life. Once they happen, people think, oh, that was obvious. But they just it takes us to actually do the thing for people to recognize, oh, we should have just been doing this for a while. But I think I'm struggling, and this is part of this initiative, Better Ways of Knowing, is how do we infuse most of the institutions that we work with? So it's not just something that we can think of 1 or 2 or 3 examples of people who are doing the thing that is helpful. How do we infuse our institutions with, if we think history is important, then historians should always be part of the conversation. If we think values also shape the type of interventions we have, and instead of just science, maybe philosophers should be part of that conversation, artists, as you said. So I think it's the challenge, at least for me, in the way I see it, is how do we make this a reality of just not having one-on-one conversations, we mentioned 4 or 5 examples of people, but something that we think is just should be routine. And I think that is the tricky part. I don't know if you disagree.
No, I think that's absolutely. I was part of the committee that stood up the School of Public Health, and the humanists in the room were just banging their fists on the table. You have to have humanists involved in every part, because I think the richness of the conversation at the Better Ways of Knowing convening was the fact that you had all of these people in epidemiology who are working worldwide in public health, but you had a philosopher, you had a historian, you had a cultural historian, you had people talking about Bruno Latour, and all of these, the medical gaze. And I think that enriched the conversation and actually shaped the final list of items, the takeaways, seriously. In fact, I thought that the historian who was talking about humility and heterogeneity was among the most influential people in the room. So,
I agree.
And he's in a school of public health, so he's doing both things. He's doing both things. And So I hope that there's more space Because the way a person in literature or a person in visual arts reads, interprets is different. And what we want are options. We want to expand the options in terms of our ways of knowing and telling what we know, right?
So then 2 or 3 years, I think the initiative would be done by 3 years. What would you want us to do? What would be helpful for us to do as an initiative? So that was the first convening. We have multiple convenings coming up. We have global learnings that you would consider a success just moving forward. Or if not, even if you think we're very far from what needs to be done, but we're at least hopefully moving in the right direction, like what questions should be asking? So I am here, I'm open for concrete ideas of what needs to be done, but also if you think there are like just like more or better questions we need to be asking in public health.
I thought that the takeaways were extraordinary. I just thought the discourse was at a level and the foundational knowledge was so impressive. And the openness to new ideas in that particular group. I don't know how you find a better group. I thought they were just really sort of the openness to dialogue, the generosity in the room was incredible. I hope that you will be able to find more people from across the world who will contribute. I'm sure that there are many. One of the things that I think I am more and more interested in performance. I think it would be really interesting to have a performance event at your next convening and then ask people to respond to what it means. I do think about the impact of performance art on reshaping the public's behavior with respect to different controversies or problems in public health. I mean, I don't know how broad the influence, but it seems like it was pretty impactful. I mean, you think about the 1980s AIDS sort of resistance art and the kind of information that it provided. But, I think it would be really exciting to have a performance piece and have your sort of deeply rooted science-based people respond and say that was irrelevant, that had meaning. What can we draw from that in terms of our own conversation, but also our action? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Rebecca, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This episode was edited by Catalina Melendez-Contreras with marketing by Kinkini Bahadre. Complicating the Narrative is supported by the WashU Pursky School of Public Health. And this miniseries is part of the Building Better Ways of Knowing project, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. If this conversation was useful to you, please pass it along to a colleague who cares about the future of public health. Thank you for listening.